At 3:42 a.m. on April 16th, 1943, the North Atlantic was nothing but black water and colder wind, a featureless emptiness broken only by the long white wake of U-623 cutting east toward the Bay of Biscay. Oberleutnant Zur See Hans Kessler stood on the conning tower, his eyes burning from lack of sleep, his skin raw from the salt spray. He had been at sea for 21 days. His crew was exhausted, running low on fresh water, bodies aching from the constant roll of the ocean. But Kessler had one priority left: bring his boat home. U-623 had survived 3 convoy attacks, 2 depth charge hunts, and 1 near-fatal encounter with a surface escort that had fired blindly into the night. The Atlantic had taken 24 U-boats already that month. Every captain knew the odds were worsening. For months, German submarine doctrine depended on the same assumptions. Allied aircraft could not see at night, could not locate a submerged U-boat by sensors alone, could not strike beyond the narrow range of spotlights and flares. The ocean was vast, and night was the U-boat's ally. The surface was the battleground, the dark hours the shield. Every commander believed that. Every patrol plan depended on that belief. By spring 1943, those assumptions were becoming false. But Kessler did not know it yet. The air smelled of diesel, coal brine, and electric ozone from the tower wiring. The horizon was empty. The sea state was calm by Atlantic standards, 4-meter swell, steady wind from the southwest. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. His radio man below deck had intercepted several Allied transmissions earlier in the night, but none indicated air patrols in the region. The boat's batteries were half drained. U-623 needed to run on the surface to recharge before sunrise. Diving now meant losing valuable range. Diving for no reason meant risk. Kessler made the same decision every U-boat commander made under these conditions. Stay surfaced. Scan the horizon. Trust the darkness. Trust the old rules. 20 miles to the west, an aircraft moved through the night sky at 165 knots, its engines running at low pitch, barely audible over the wind. It carried no spotlight, no visible flame from exhaust stacks, no flares, no illumination of any kind. It flew just above the cloud layer, unseen and unheard. Inside its cramped fuselage, a new device hummed. It was not a bomb, not a gun, not a camera. To the 6-man RAF crew aboard the short Sunderland, the device represented something far more valuable than firepower. It could detect metal beneath waves. It could find a submarine in darkness. It could see where the human eye saw nothing. ASV Mark III radar. Allied engineers called it centimetric radar. U-boat crews had no idea it existed. Kessler leaned forward slightly, squinting at the horizon. His breath formed a faint mist in the cold air. He rubbed fatigue from his eyes. The phosphorescent wake glowed faintly behind the boat, like a ghostly trail. Nothing ahead, nothing to port or starboard. He glanced upward on instinct, but the sky was empty darkness. Moonless, clouded, a perfect night for running. His watch officer below was charting a course for the morning, planning to submerge at 6 o'clock. Routine. Familiar. Safe. The early phase of the Battle of the Atlantic had conditioned commanders to act with confidence. In 1941 and 1942, U-boats dominated the shipping lanes. Convoys burned in moonlight. Tankers exploded in sheets of flame that lit the waves for miles. Wolf packs swarmed unprotected vessels. Allied escorts were few. Aircraft lacked range. The ocean belonged to the submarines. Every tactical report reinforced the same truth. The night protected them. But April 1943 marked the turning point. Allied industry accelerated. New escorts arrived in greater numbers. Escort carriers sailed with convoys. Radar improved. Communications tightened. American long-range aircraft filled coverage gaps. The Atlantic was changing. Kessler sensed the danger in briefings, but he did not understand its scale. No one in the Kriegsmarine command chain understood it completely. The U-boat headquarters in Lorya still believed the Wolfpack strategy would hold. They believed losses were temporary. They believed the night remained safe. It no longer was. At 3:48 a.m., the Sunderland's radar operator leaned toward his screen, watching a faint return pulse strengthen. One bright blip against dark background. Distance closing. The radar beam swept again. The blip reappeared in the same location. Not a wave crest. Not atmospheric interference. Something metallic. Something long. Something moving at 9 knots on the surface. He adjusted the gain carefully. Range, 7.8 miles. Bearing, 082 degrees. The operator marked it. The pilot altered course slightly, keeping altitude low, masking approach with cloud cover. U-623 continued east. Diesel engines rumbled steadily beneath the deck plates. The boat's bow rose and fell gently. The night was quiet except for wind and water. Kessler shifted his weight and scanned the sky again. Nothing. No stars. No silhouettes. No engine noise. His mind drifted toward the warmth below deck. Coffee. A few minutes of rest. Perhaps a brief note for the war diary. But he stayed on the tower. A commander remained alert. The Sunderland descended to 1,500 feet. The sea darkened beneath it. The radar returned sharpened. The U-boat had no idea death was approaching through the clouds. The Allies had introduced Lee lights the year before. Massive searchlights capable of blinding U-boats at close range during night attacks. But Lee lights require the aircraft to know where the submarine was. Older radar sets were imprecise. Submarines often doved before the aircraft arrived. But the new centimetric radar changed everything. It could pinpoint a U-boat at night with precision. It operated on wavelengths the Germans could not detect. Metox, the U-boat radar warning receiver, listened for older Allied radars. It heard nothing from ASV Mark III. Kessler's receiver remained static and silent. At 3:53 a.m., the Sunderland broke through a thin cloud bank. The sea stretched below like black glass. The pilot throttled back to maintain silence. The crew prepared for attack. Depth charges were armed. Release racks checked. No flares. No lights. No visibility needed. The approaching submarine glowed as a bright pulse on the radar screen, its position unhidden by darkness. U-623 continued to run east, oblivious. Kessler exhaled slowly. The night was cold but calm. He noted the wind direction. He estimated arrival time at the Bay of Biscay. If weather held, they would reach friendly air cover before noon. He planned to submerge once the sun rose. The watch officer below deck checked bearings and plotted the next position fix. Routine motions of an experienced crew. At 3:55 a.m., the Sunderland leveled at 1,200 feet. The radar operator gave final corrections. Range, 1.9 miles. The aircraft turned slightly starboard to line up the approach. The submarine was unaware. No ivasi menuve. No krasdive. No alarm bell ringing below deck. The U-boat was vulnerable, silhouetted faintly by its own white wake. The sea ahead of Kessler looked unchanged. He blinked against the chill wind. A tiny point of movement caught his eye far above the horizon. Too faint to identify, too brief, a shape dissolving into darkness as quickly as it appeared. He inhaled, uncertain whether he'd imagined it. Fatigue played tricks on the eyes. Training told him the sky was empty. Logic told him the aircraft could not find them at this hour. Fear whispered that something had changed in recent weeks. Reports of U-boats destroyed without warning. Boats sunk at night by aircraft that crews never saw. Rumors of new Allied technology. But rumors were common. Most were false. Kislastet oppoigen. The Sunderland descended rapidly. The pilot aligned the aircraft directly behind the U-boat's track. The radar image showed perfect closure. Altitude, 800 feet. Speed, 150 knots. Distance, 0.9 miles. Too far for the U-boat crew to hear engines over the wind. Too dark for eyes to detect the aircraft. The Sunderland's crew prepared for the attack run, ready to drop a pattern of 7 depth charges spaced to straddle the submarine's path. At 3:58 a.m., Kessler heard something. A faint difference in the wind, a low vibration in the air. He turned his head slightly, listening. Not diesel engines, not the ocean, something else. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing toward the sky behind the boat's wake. A thin, indistinct shape emerged from cloud shadow, moving fast, descending, silent until the final moment. The Sunderland's black silhouette eclipsed a faint patch of stars for one heartbeat. Kessler opened his mouth instinctively to shout an order, but there was no time for orders. No time for reaction. No time even for breath. The Sunderland roared overhead at 400 feet. The wake of U-623 exploded in white water as 7 depth charges entered the sea in a tight pattern. Each sank for seconds. Pressure triggers armed. The ocean swallowed them. Silence returned briefly. Then the Atlantic convulsed. A column of water thicker than the conning tower erupted upward behind the boat. Shockwaves hammered the steel hull. Men below deck were thrown from bunks and consoles. Glass shattered. Pipes ruptured. Batteries slammed against their mounts. Kessler's knees buckled as the tower shook violently, a blast wave slamming upward through the structure. The boat lurched sideways as another charge detonated to port, sending a wall of water across the deck. The lights below deck flickered once and went dark. The war had changed. Kessler had no warning, no detection, no defense. The night was no longer an ally. The old rules were dead. A new weapon had arrived, one that U-boat commanders did not understand, one that hunted them in silence, unseen. And in those first seconds after the explosions, as metal groaned and the hull creaked under pressure, Kessler realized the terrifying truth. The Allies could see them in the dark. He had entered a battlefield where the enemy was invisible, and he was already too late to escape. The interior of U-623 plunged into chaos the moment the depth charges detonated. The first shock wave slammed through the hull like a giant hammer, rolling the boat 10 degrees to port, then 20 back to starboard. Men were thrown into bulkheads, instruments shattered under the impact, gauges cracked, lamps swung violently on their mounts. The forward compartment filled with choking smoke as electrical insulation burned. The diesel engines, still running at full power, staggered under the concussion. Their mounts flexed. Couplings shuddered. A fine mist of fuel sprayed from an overstressed line in the engine room, drifting into the air like a thin, flammable cloud. The second explosion, closer, deeper, hit beneath the stern. The hull flexed. Rivets strained. Water forced its way through microscopic seams that had held through earlier attacks, but finally yielded under sustained shock. A cold spray jetted across the battery deck, landing on the metal casing of a forward accumulator. The droplets hissed faintly. Salt water and battery acid were a lethal combination. Chlorine gas formed in seconds. A petty officer gagged as he inhaled the first traces, eyes stinging. Another sailor grabbed a soaked rag and pressed it over his mouth, knowing the gas would spread quickly through confined compartments. Kessler struggled to stand on the conning tower platform as the boat lurched beneath him. The tower rails vibrated violently from the blast, metal trembling under the strain. Spray drenched him. He felt cold water seep through the collar of his coat. His ears rang with the aftershock. For a brief instant, he saw the Sunderland banking away, disappearing into the dark as silently as it had appeared. The aircraft's engines were little more than a fading hum over the wind. It had attacked with perfect timing and departed before the U-boat could respond. The old rules were gone. The U-boat was no longer the hunter. It was prey. Below deck, the chief engineer shouted orders that no one heard in the confusion. Men crawled across the slanted deck, reaching for valves and levers. The depth gauge needle trembled as seawater entered the boat, not enough to sink it outright, but enough to threaten stability if flooding spread. The U-boat's interior smelled of oil, burning insulation, diesel fumes, and the first hints of chlorine. Two sailors coughed violently as the gas spread, eyes watering, lungs tightening. Others tore open lockers, searching for respirators in the dim, flickering emergency lights. The diesel engines sputtered and stalled. A brief silence followed, broken only by groaning metal and the roar of water slamming against the hull. The boat lost forward momentum. The bow dipped into a swell, sending a sheet of black water across the deck. The conning tower shook again, its interior instruments going dark as the electrical circuit shorted. Kessler descended the tower ladder into the control room, clutching the cold steel rungs. The compartment below was half lit by a single red emergency lamp that cast elongated shadows across the cramped space. Men moved in frantic half silhouettes, bodies colliding, hands reaching for controls, eyes wide with the realization that the attack was not an isolated threat. It was a revelation. A new kind of enemy had arrived in the Atlantic. The ballast tanks groaned as they took on water through loosened seals, destabilizing the boat. The chief engineer fought to close the hull valves manually. Hydraulic pressure fluctuated. Several gauges were cracked. The trim pump sputtered and failed, its gears jammed by debris shaken loose by the explosions. Sweat mixed with seawater and oil on the faces of the crew. Boots slipped on wet metal. Every surface was slick. The attack had come from total darkness with no warning. The new Allied radar had seen through the night. Metox, the trusted detector, had given no signal. Kessler stared at the silent receiver mounted above the chart table. The green indicator light glowed faintly. It had heard nothing. It had been blind to the threat. The U-boat was blind as well. A junior helmsman steadied himself against the wheel as the boat rolled again under the weight of incoming water. The stern compartments were flooding slowly, not fast enough to sink them immediately, but enough to destabilize the vessel if not contained. The crew worked by muscle memory and experience, hands moving across the same pipes and levers they had touched hundreds of times. But this time the stakes were different. This time the ocean was not a battlefield. It was an executioner. Kessler reached the control console and gripped the edge to steady himself. The metal felt warm from electrical stress. Several indicator lamps were dark. Others flickered erratically. The electric motors remained functional, but their power reserves were limited. Running submerged on batteries with structural damage and flooding was dangerous. Surfacing again was even more dangerous. They were caught between two fatal choices. The Sunderland did not return. It did not need to. The pilot had executed a perfect attack, using technology unknown to Kessler. The explosion pattern had been calculated to straddle the U-boat's track precisely. The depth charges had detonated at the exact depth where their blast waves would concentrate against the hull. The boat stabilized slightly as sailors stemmed the flow of water from a ruptured joint in the engine room. Temporary patching materials were applied in the dim lantern glow. The chief engineer turned a valve wheel with both hands, his knuckles white, his muscles trembling from adrenaline and strain. The flow slowed, not completely, but enough to buy minutes, perhaps an hour, perhaps less. Kessler stepped into the aft compartment. Battery fumes mixed with chlorine gas thickened the air. Men gagged as they worked, eyes watering. The boat lacked adequate ventilation at depth. The air grew heavier with each breath. Sailors opened a bulkhead vent manually, trying to circulate air toward the central compartment. The small act might delay poisoning for a few minutes. It would not prevent it. He returned to the control room. The U-boat's trim stabilized temporarily at 3 degrees bow up. The depth gauge showed they were still on the surface, though barely. Heavy swells washed across the deck, threatening to drag the boat under with each passing wave. The airframe of the Sunderland was nowhere to be seen through the periscope optics. A crewman wiped blood from his forehead where he had struck a valve handle during the blast. He glanced at the captain for orders. Kessler felt the weight of expectation heavy on his shoulders. The decisions of the next minutes would determine whether any of them survived. The boat could submerge to escape a second attack, but diving with structural damage risked catastrophic hull failure. Remaining surfaced invited further air attacks. Running for home was impossible. Limping toward deeper water offered no guarantee. Kessler closed his eyes briefly, recalling the training scenarios drilled into him in Bremen. The manuals provided protocols for depth charge attacks. They did not provide guidance for invisible enemies. They did not describe technology beyond detection. They did not account for Allied radar the Germans could not hear. They did not warn that the night sky could reveal a submarine's position with pinpoint accuracy. He opened his eyes and made his choice. The ballast tanks flooded slightly more as seawater entered through a second compromised seal. The bow dipped. The boat teetered on the edge of maintaining surface buoyancy. The crew fought to stabilize trim with manual controls. Sweat dripped from their brows. Their fingers trembled under the stress of seconds that stretched into years. The U-boat began to descend involuntarily as a large swell lifted the stern. The deck angle shifted. Loose tools slid across the floor with a metallic clatter. A lantern swung violently on its hook. Panic flickered in the eyes of younger crew members, but discipline held. Experience replaced fear. The chief engineer braced himself against the bulkhead, muscles taut, ready for the next command. Kessler turned toward the helm and lowered his center of gravity to keep balance. The deck shook again as the hull groaned. He felt the boat surrendering to the weight of the ocean. The surface had betrayed them. The air above was no longer safe. He issued the only order that gave them any chance at survival. The ballast tanks began to fill rapidly as the crew opened the vent valves. Water rushed in. The bow dipped sharply. The stern followed. The boat slid beneath the surface, its steel hull groaning at the sudden change in pressure. The night sky vanished behind a curtain of black water. The ocean swallowed U-623 completely. Flooding increased in the stern compartment as water seeped through weakened weld seams. The chief engineer scrambled to isolate the damaged sections. Men worked by feel, the compartment dark except for a dim emergency lamp flickering wildly. The air grew more toxic. Every breath tasted of acid and metal. The boat leveled at 15 meters. The motors engaged. The electric whine hummed through the steel frame. The U-boat crept forward into the dark, its movements sluggish from the weight of water inside. The depth gauge needle trembled between 20 and 25 meters, a dangerous depth when structural integrity was compromised. Kessler steadied himself in the control room. His vision blurred momentarily. He blinked hard, adjusting to the dim red light. He could feel the boat's weakened frame flex under pressure with each wave above. The hull had survived, but only barely. Somewhere above, the Sunderland banked west to search for more targets. The pilot did not know if the submarine had sunk. The radar operator marked the last known position. The crew awaited instructions from Coastal Command. Their mission was to clear the Atlantic of U-boats. One attack was seldom enough, but tonight they had more targets waiting hundreds of miles east. They departed to continue the widening net that was slowly strangling the German submarine fleet. Below the surface, U-623 pushed forward through dark water that offered both safety and suffocation. The electric motors hummed unevenly, their power reserves dwindling with each minute. Battery levels were falling faster than expected, partly from damage, partly from radiation of energy through compromised insulation. The boat could not remain submerged long. It needed to surface eventually, but surfacing meant exposure. Exposure meant death. The control room air thickened. Condensation formed on the bulkheads. Every metal surface felt cold and clammy. The crew breathed shallow, labored breaths. Kessler felt tightness in his chest. Chlorine gas lingered in the aft compartment despite ventilation efforts. Men coughed in the darkness, lungs burning. Two sailors lay collapsed near the battery deck, unconscious but alive. The chief engineer approached from the stern, his face streaked with soot. He steadied himself with one hand on the bulkhead. His eyes were reddened by fumes. His breathing was heavy. He reported the flooding level in the stern compartment with hand signs instead of words. Kessler nodded grimly. The amount of water was increasing. Slowly, relentlessly, the boat descended another meter. Then another. The depth gauge needle fluttered. The hull moaned softly under pressure. Submerging further risked collapse. Remaining at current depth risked discovery by his sonar-equipped escorts or another aircraft equipped with radar and acoustic buoys. Kessler knew the truth. The ocean was no longer a sanctuary. The surface was no longer a place to breathe. The world had changed. The Allies had introduced a weapon his training had not prepared him for. They could see U-boats at night. They could strike from the sky without warning. They could turn the ocean into a trap. He placed one hand on the periscope column to steady himself and stared into the dim glow of the control room, watching the men who depended on him. They worked with quiet determination, driven by discipline and fear. They had volunteered for the Atlantic, believing they knew the risks. They did not know this one. The boat crept eastward beneath the waves. The electric motors hummed. Battery levels dropped. Air quality worsened. Water seeped through weakened seams. Time pressed down on them as surely as the ocean. Above, the night sky remained silent. The Sunderland had vanished, but its impact lingered. U-623 was still alive, but the Atlantic had taken control of its fate, and the new Allied weapon that struck them in the dark was only the beginning of what awaited every U-boat commander who dared the surface. The descent of U-623 settled briefly at 28 meters, the hull creaking under the steady pressure of the sea. The electric motors reverberated through the compartments with a low, strained vibration, barely audible over the labored breaths of the crew. In a confined space, air thickened with every passing minute. Moisture collected on bulkheads and dripped slowly onto the deck, mixing with pools of seawater that sloshed with each subtle shift in trim. The boat, designed for stealth and endurance, now felt like a sealed chamber where time compressed, making seconds feel heavier than steel. The chief engineer supported himself against a valve column, his face pale in the dim red emergency lighting. The stern flooding had slowed, but not stopped. Water seeped in unpredictable pulses from ruptured joints, creating a rhythm that matched the groaning of the hull. The crew had applied every patch within reach. Anything more required resurfacing, exposing the boat to another attack. The battery deck emitted a faint, acrid smell of overheating insulation. The temperature rose steadily. Hydrogen levels increased near the ceiling, an invisible but lethal threat. One spark, even from a failing electrical contact, could turn the compartment into an explosion chamber. The crew knew this. Their movements grew more deliberate. Fewer metal tools were allowed to strike the deck. Even footsteps softened. The ocean outside was silent. The aircraft that had delivered the attack had vanished into black distances. But silence did not mean safety. Silence meant uncertainty. Aircraft could return. Escort carriers could be approaching from over the horizon. The new Allied hunter-killer groups had begun sweeping the Atlantic in coordinated patterns, combining radar-equipped aircraft with fast destroyers and corvettes. The Germans had no comparable system. They relied on stealth and the cover of darkness. And darkness no longer protected them. Kessler remained in the control room, his posture tense, shoulders rigid. He studied the depth gauge needle as if willing it to remain steady. His hands gripped the edge of the chart table to stabilize himself against the imperceptible roll of the boat. The weight of the water above pressed against the hull with clinical indifference, a constant reminder of the ocean's power. 623 survived through a combination of engineering margins and human will. Both were nearing their limits. The air purifier system was struggling. Filters designed to scrub carbon dioxide at shallow depths now labored inefficiently at increasing concentration levels. Crewmen breathed faster, using oxygen more quickly than the system could compensate. At 30 meters, the partial pressure of oxygen felt thin yet simultaneously oppressive, as though every inhalation required effort. A faint haze hung in the compartment, illuminated only by the dull red lamps. Battery charge dropped to 88%, then 83, then 80. The chief engineer marked the declining values with steady strokes in a logbook already stained with seawater and oil. The numbers told the truth. They could not remain submerged for long. A damaged U-boat consumed battery reserves faster than a fully functional one. Flooding, damaged insulation, and struggling air systems amplified the draw. The temperature of the electric motors rose incrementally. Copper windings emitted a faint metallic scent as they endured stress. Even at reduced throttle, the motor strained. Water resistance increased with hull deformation, making progress slow. The ocean resisted every motion, as though squeezing the boat from all sides. Forward in the torpedo room, two sailors knelt beside a pressure valve, adjusting the trim tanks manually. Their breaths came in short bursts. Sweat dripped from their foreheads onto the steel deck. One of them paused momentarily, pressing a hand to his chest as air thinned. Another sailor leaned against a bulkhead, eyes half closed, lungs burning from chlorine exposure earlier. He remained conscious through sheer will, refusing to leave his post. The U-boat crept eastward, hoping to put distance between itself and the attack site. But distance alone meant little. The aircraft's radar had fixed their position precisely. It had transmitted coordinates to Coastal Command. Destroyers could be dispatched along probable escape routes. Other aircraft could sweep the region at dawn. Surfacing remained unthinkable. Submerging much deeper was equally impossible. U-623 existed in a fragile band of water where survival balanced between two catastrophes. Kessler kept his eyes on the trim indicator. The bow dipped slightly as the stern flooded further. He signaled the chief engineer with a glance. The engineer responded with a barely perceptible nod, acknowledging that the leak was worsening. They had slowed it, not stopped it. If pressure increased, or if the hull flexed from a passing swell above, the leak could widen. Seawater infiltration in the stern compartment threatened the starboard propulsion shaft housing. If water reached the bearings, the shaft could seize, locking the propeller and sending a catastrophic vibration through the boat. The forward compartment lights dimmed again. Electric instability rippled through the system. One momentary power drop sent panic through the crew. If lighting failed completely, the boat would plunge into darkness. The red emergency lamps flickered but held. The chief electrician inspected power cables with a handheld lantern, its faint beam cutting through the haze. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the cumulative stress of hours spent combating damage in an oxygen-poor environment. Battery voltage dipped again, 78%, then 76. Time pressed harder. U-623 required air. It required fresh oxygen. It required a functioning diesel engine to charge batteries, to ventilate compartments, to power life support systems. Every U-boat depended on the surface, no matter how dangerous. Total submergence meant eventual death. Every commander knew this intimately. Submarines were not boats that lived beneath the sea. They were boats that survived on the surface and hid below only when threatened. Hiding had become fatal. The surface had become worse. Above them, the first hints of dawn approached the eastern horizon. The sky remained black in the depths. But currents shifted subtly as the ocean responded to the changing temperature gradient. Small eddies formed along the hull. Pressure variances made the steel skin creak. The crew noticed the faint change instinctively. Dawn meant aircraft. Aircraft meant radar. Radar meant death. Kessler felt the shift inside his bones. He steadied his breathing. The boat could not stay submerged through dawn. Battery levels would fall too low. Air quality would deteriorate. Chlorine concentrations would rise. Carbon dioxide would reach dangerous levels. Men would collapse. Consciousness would fade. Panic would spread. Survival required surfacing. Surfacing required accepting vulnerability. He studied the chart table. The map of the Atlantic lay beneath a cracked glass cover, damp at the edges from seawater spray earlier. Their position placed them more than 100 miles west of the Bay of Biscay. Too far for immediate support. Too close to Allied patrol routes. Too exposed beneath the shifting web of radar coverage that now extended deeper into the Atlantic than ever before. The ocean pressed in on them. The hull trembled. Battery gauge read 71%. The chief engineer approached the control room, breathing heavily. He braced himself against a handrail and steadied his voice. The stern flooding continued at a rate too slow to cause immediate sinking, but too fast to ignore. The makeshift patch held, but strained under each shift in pressure. Isolation valves remained functional, but the structural compromise would worsen with any sudden change in depth. Remaining submerged much longer risked catastrophic failure. Kessler assessed the numbers again. They painted a single conclusion. The boat had a surface. Not now, not immediately, but soon. The crew sensed his realization, even without verbal confirmation. Their glances shifted toward him, eyes searching for direction. Their movements slowed as desperation pressed upon them. No one spoke. No one needed to. The unspoken truth settled over every man aboard the damaged vessel. The surface alone offered air. The surface alone offered diesel power. The surface alone offered survival. And the surface promised death. Kessler stepped toward the periscope. His boots splashed in a thin film of water. He lowered the scope with deliberate control, listening to the faint whir of the gears. The lens cleared the tower column. He rotated it slowly, scanning the dark water above. He saw nothing but wave reflections. The horizon was invisible from this depth. No silhouettes of masts. No shadows of aircraft wings. No searchlights. No signs of life. Only darkness. The periscope optics flickered briefly as condensation fogged the lens. He wiped it with a cloth. His hand trembled faintly. Fatigue crept into his muscles from hours of tension. He steadied himself and scanned again. Still nothing. He raised the scope slightly, testing the water level above. Waves rolled across the lens in gray ribbons. The surface remained too rough for immediate surfacing. A heavy swell could slam against the damaged hull, widening cracks, forcing more water through the compromised stern seams. Depth gauge, 26 meters. Battery charge, 69%. Air quality, poor, worsening. Kessler lowered the scope and made a calculation. They would rise slowly. No rush to the surface. No sudden changes that could strain the hull. He would take the boat to 10 meters. Shallow enough to shorten the time needed to break the surface. Deep enough to remain hidden from a casual radar sweep. They would wait until the sea calmed. Then surface. Then run at maximum speed toward the east, toward the Bay of Biscay, toward the possibility of Luftwaffe air cover. It was not a plan of confidence. It was a plan of necessity. The crew began venting ballast water with slow precision. The boat ascended gradually. At 22 meters, the hull emitted a long, low groan. At 20 meters, vibrations rippled through the stern compartments. The crew paused adjustments until the structure settled. The ascent continued. Battery level, 67%. The boat reached 16 meters. The ocean above felt closer. Its presence heavy, but less suffocating. The hull flexed again as swells passed overhead. Kessler raised the periscope once more. The lens emerged briefly into the dawn-lit water before being kissed by a wave crest. Light diffused through the surface, soft and pale. Morning approached. The surface remained empty, but radar did not require visibility. Kisla exhaled slowly. He steadied his breathing. The decision approached like an inevitable tide. He gripped the periscope handles and stared into a world that no longer followed old rules. The Allies had changed the nature of war at sea. U-boats had lost the advantage of darkness. The Atlantic had become a battleground of invisible beams and silent hunters. Battery charge, 66%. Air, heavy and toxic. Flooding, slow but persistent. Depth, 15 meters. Kessler steadied himself. The surface waited above them. Cold, hostile, necessary. And whatever waited on that surface would decide the fate of you. 6:23. The ascent to 15 meters stabilized briefly, the hull adjusting to internal stresses with slow metallic creaks that vibrated through every surface of the boat. The crew felt each groan of the frame as a warning. The stern flooding had not worsened during the rise, but the structural fatigue from the earlier depth charge blasts remained a silent threat. Any sudden pressure change could widen one of the microfractures running through the stressed steel plates. 623 hovered in a fragile equilibrium between survival and collapse. The faint gradient of dawn filtered through the water above. Light reached the periscope head in soft pulses as waves passed over, alternately brightening and darkening the view. Kessler watched that shifting pattern for long seconds, his breathing controlled, his mind cycling through every potential outcome. The sea appeared empty, but the surface was deceptive. Radar needed no sunlight. Aircraft could sweep the region invisibly. A destroyer hull could emerge over the horizon with no warning, its sonar operators trained to interpret every faint reflection beneath the water. Battery charge dropped to 64%. Air quality declined more rapidly as more carbon dioxide accumulated. The crew's breathing grew shallow. Sweating increased as the internal temperature climbed. A mist of condensation coated the overhead pipes and wiring, dripping continuously, making the floor slick and treacherous. Every man felt the weight of deteriorating oxygen levels pressing against his lungs. They had minutes, perhaps an hour, before impairment spread. The chief engineer wiped his mouth with his sleeve damp from seawater and sweat. His movement slowed, but his focus remained sharp. He monitored the stern flooding, recalculated internal ballast weight, and evaluated the pressure on the compromised plates near the starboard shaft housing. The leak had slowed to a rhythmic seep. Not catastrophic, not stable. The kind of leak that could hold for another hour or could rupture in seconds. Kessler studied the numbers. 64% battery, 15 meters depth, air borderline, flooding contained, hull strained. These values spiraled toward a single point. They would have to surface, and soon. He placed both hands on the periscope handles and raised the optics again. A wave crest washed over the head, distorting the view. Then clarity returned. The horizon appeared in streaks of gray-blue. No masts, no silhouettes, no winds. The sea surface rolled gently under a pale sky, deceptive in its calmness. The illusion of safety filled the lens for a moment, but Kessler did not allow himself to accept it. Aircraft flew far beyond visual ranges. Destroyers could hide behind the curvature of the earth, waiting for sonar pings from planes above. The surface held opportunities for survival and opportunities for destruction. He lowered the periscope. He adjusted his footing as another faint vibration rippled through the hull. The crew sensed it too. A moment of stillness followed, the kind that carried unsaid questions. They understood the implications of surfacing after a radar-guided attack. The ocean's surface was no longer sanctuary. It was a place of exposure. Battery charge drifted to 63%. Air quality triggered an internal alarm light, glowing dull amber. The air purification system labored to filter carbon dioxide, but its capacity was limited. The ratio of toxic gas increased steadily. Men coughed softly. Two sailors leaned against the bulkhead in the stern, eyes closed, barely conscious as chlorine residue lingered from earlier flooding. The chief engineer retrieved a portable oxygen kit from a storage locker and fitted masks on the two unconscious sailors, hoping to prevent irreversible damage. The supply was limited. It was not intended for sustained submerged operation. It was meant for emergencies, brief crises, not extended entrapment beneath the sea. But their situation extended beyond any standard emergency. They were facing the consequences of a technological shift neither they nor their superiors had foreseen. The trim indicator showed slight instability. The bow rose by half a degree. The stern dipped slightly as water seeped in. Kessler steadied the boat with minor adjustments to the forward trim tanks. The movements were slow, almost imperceptible. Every adjustment required caution. Every mistake risked the hull. He examined the chart again. Their position placed them within known Allied air patrol zones. Dawn would bring more aircraft. Radar-equipped Liberators, Catalinus, and Sunderlands patrolled these waters daily. Surfacing meant detection. Detection meant attack. But submerging meant suffocation. The decision came with clarity born from necessity. Kessler signaled the chief engineer with a nod. The crew adjusted ballast valves. The boat rose to 12 meters. Pressure decreased slightly. The hull creaked in relief. The periscope head broke the surface for a moment, offering a blurred image of rolling waves glistening under early morning light. Kistlaskentekin. Still no masts, no wakes, no aircraft shadows across the sky. Battery charge, 61%. The chief engineer wiped sweat from his brow as the temperature continued to rise. Moisture dripped from the overhead, falling onto the metal deck in steady taps. The air tasted metallic, tinged with battery fumes. Men inhaled shallow breaths, conserving what little oxygen remained. Every inhalation felt thick. U-623 drifted at 12 meters for another minute. Then 10. Kessler watched the depth gauge inch upward. The ocean above grew brighter, shimmering with diffused sunlight. The crew braced themselves, gripping pipes and handrails, anticipating the moment when the hull would break through the surface tension. At 9 meters, vibrations intensified. Pressure equalization occurred as upper hull plates began interacting with the interface between air and water. The boat rocked lightly, as if on the verge of emergence. Then the first danger sign appeared. A faint hum reverberated through the water. Not internal, not from the boat. It came from above. Soft at first, barely distinguishable from the ocean's ambient noise. A steady, rhythmic pulse. Aircraft. Kessler froze for a heartbeat, his senses sharpening in the suffocating air. He raised the periscope faster than before. Water cascaded off the optics as they breached the surface. He scanned the horizon with rapid, controlled movements. The ocean extended peacefully in every direction. Nothing. He rotated the optics upward. Pale morning sky. Empty. No specks. No silhouettes. But the hum persisted. It deepened. Louder. Closer. Not visible. Not overhead. The sound came from somewhere east of the boat, beyond the curving horizon. Aircraft flying low. Radar sweeping the sea, perhaps directly toward them. Kessler's breath tightened. He lowered the periscope slowly, mind racing through options that offered no escape. They were trapped in a deadly space between depths too dangerous to descend and surface exposure too dangerous to endure. Battery charge, 60%. Air quality, poor, approaching dangerous. Hull integrity, stable but fragile. Flooding, contained but increasing. The aircraft noise intensified. Kessler steadied himself and forced clarity of thought. He could not submerge deeper without risking hull collapse. He could not surface while an aircraft approached. Remaining at periscope depth consumed precious battery power and poisoned the crew with carbon dioxide. He stood motionless in the control room, eyes tracking the red flicker of the air quality indicator, breathing shallowly as the carbon dioxide level increased. Men coughed and wheezed. The chief engineer leaned against the bulkhead, chest rising and falling heavily. The hum grew into a vibrating drone that pulsed through the hull. The ocean above you, 623 shimmered in muted dawn light as the boat hovered at 9 meters, trapped between two lethal elements, pressure and air. The aircraft engine noise deepened into a heavy, resonant drone that pulsed through the hull like the heartbeat of an approaching predator. The crew felt it before Kessler confirmed its presence. Vibrations moved through the steel frame, subtle but distinct, a low-frequency tremor that signaled proximity. Every man understood what it meant. They had surfaced into an ambush zone. The Liberator closed distance with steady inevitability, its radar sweeping the water with invisible arcs no German instrument could detect. The ASV Mark III system aboard the aircraft had already fixed U-623's precise position long before the periscope identified its silhouette. Operators aboard the bomber tracked the submarine in silence, adjusting approach vectors with mechanical precision. The radar pulse painted the U-boat as a bright, stable return on their screen. The ocean could hide nothing from it. Battery charge slipped to 58%. Air quality deteriorated further, carbon dioxide rising to levels that impaired cognitive clarity. Sailors blinked rapidly, fighting the dizziness that preceded unconsciousness. The chief engineer clutched the bulkhead to maintain balance, his fingers leaving streaks of moisture on cold steel. Every breath drew in air that tasted stale and acidic, heavy with contaminants. The boat had reached the limit of its submerged endurance. Kessler stood rigid near the periscope column, his posture tense, hands clenched at his sides. His eyes remained fixed on the depth gauge. He felt the hull flex faintly as the ocean moved above them. He sensed the pressure differential between safety and destruction narrowing with every second. The decision that had haunted him for the past half hour sharpened into a single line of clarity. They would surface, not because it was safe, but because it was the only option left that allowed the possibility of survivors. The Liberator loomed overhead, invisible from the periscope's last scan, but unmistakable in acoustic signature. Its engines ran steady, maintaining altitude at roughly 300 meters. The aircraft drifted into position on a course parallel to U-623's predicted surfacing point. Its bomb bay doors opened with hydraulic precision. Depth charges hung in neat rows beneath the belly of the bomber, each waiting to be released in a calculated pattern designed to envelop a submarine the moment it breached. Dawn brightened the surface. The water's upper layer glowed faintly, streaked with early sunlight filtering through cloud cover. The horizon turned silver blue. It offered no comfort. It offered only visibility. At 8 meters depth, Kessler inhaled a thin, burning breath and signaled for control descent. The crew responded with the tired precision of men operating beyond physical limits. Hands moved across valves. Levers adjusted ballast flow. Pumps groaned under stress. The bow began to rise. The stern followed slowly, strained by seawater trapped in the compromised compartment. The boat ascended in slow increments, 8 meters, then 7. Pressure on the hull eased slightly as the ocean's weight decreased, but the threat above intensified. The Liberator pilot aligned the aircraft into attack position, adjusting airspeed for maximum coverage. The bombardier watched the ocean surface for the faint disturbance of a rising hull, though visual confirmation was unnecessary. Radar showed the submarine's location without margin of error. Battery charge, 57%. Depth, 6 meters. Air, critical. The boat crested through 5 meters. Light penetrated the control room, in faint flickers as the surface distortion above brightened. Water shimmered across the periscope head before the lens dipped beneath another wave. The crew braced themselves, gripping handrails, closing eyes, steadying breaths. The hull groaned from internal strain, battered by the weight of water trapped in the stern and weakened plates along the shaft housing. At 4 meters, U-623's tower pushed upward into the dawn-tinged water, invisible to the men inside, but already detected by the Liberator's radar operator as a stronger, clearer return. The bomber descended to 200 meters altitude, aligning precisely upon the U-boat's predicted bearing. The wind shifted, blowing from the southwest at 15 knots, creating a subtle drift that the pilot compensated for with minor aileron adjustments. The bomber approached its firing run with the detached focus of trained specialists. The submarine rose further, 3 meters, then 2. The tower broke the surface in a plume of white foam. Water cascaded off steel plates. The bow lifted free of the depths. U-623 emerged into open air for the first time since the attack. Every man aboard felt the sudden shift as pressure equalized. Air rushed into the conning tower vents, bringing relief mixed with dread. They had surfaced, and the Liberator was already overhead. The aircraft's engines roared through the dawn sky as it descended into attack position. The bomber approached from the northeast, flying low, casting a shadow across the water. The U-boat's crew heard the thunder of engines through the hull. Heads snapped upward, eyes widened. The cold air above the surface carried the unmistakable sound of an aircraft diving toward them. The old instinct to submerge flared in every mind. But they cannot dive. The stern flooding made descent unstable. The boat needed precious minutes to vent ballast, equalize trim, and regain submerged control. Minutes they did not have. The Liberator passed directly overhead. The shadow swept across the conning tower like the dark wing of a predatory bird. The bombardier released a series of depth charges spaced in a tight pattern, timed to detonate at shallow depth. The explosives fell in silent arcs, tumbling through the air before striking the water with muffled splashes. The sea swallowed them. Seconds stretched. Then the ocean erupted. The first depth charge detonated 10 meters off the port bow. A column of water rose higher than the tower, hammering the hull with a concussive force that shuddered through every compartment. Men were thrown sideways, collapsing against steel bulkheads. Pipes ruptured. Panels tore from mouths. The bow slammed downward into the ocean, water pouring over the deck and down the tower hatch. The second detonation came almost simultaneously, this time to starboard. Shock waves met inside the hull like colliding storms. The stern compartment's compromised plate split along a fracture line no one had seen. Seawater surged in a violent torrent. The chief engineer fell against the bulkhead as the cold surge hit him, dragging him to his knees. The lights flickered violently before failing altogether. Within moments, the stern flooded beyond recovery. The third and fourth depth charges detonated in near-perfect synchrony behind the boat, creating a vacuum effect that twisted the U-boat's stern downward. The propeller shaft housing collapsed inward. Steel screamed under pressure. Water filled the aft sections in a catastrophic rush. The submarine rolled to port. The deck sloped sharply. The tower dipped. Spray enveloped the structure. Men slid across the tilted floor, grasping at anything anchored to steel. The control room instruments shattered under the violent motion. Kessler regained his stance by sheer instinct, gripping the periscope column with all his strength as the boat pitched violently. His vision blurred. His breath tore through collapsing lungs. The hull sounded like a wounded animal as compartments ruptured and supports buckled. The boat no longer responded to commands. It had become a sinking mass of steel and water. The Liberator banked for a second pass, observing the turmoil below. Smoke and oil spread across the surface as the submarine's bow rose briefly, then plunged. The boat entered its death angle, nose high, stern heavy, sinking with increasing speed. The men aboard U-623 felt the movement shift from instability to inevitability. The stern pulled them downward. Water surged through broken seals. Compartments filled in seconds. The bow dipped beneath the waves once more. The conning tower submerged. The sea swallowed the boat with a final, violent rush. Inside, Kessler held the periscope column as darkness pressed in. The last sound he heard was the rushing roar of water collapsing through the hull. The boat descended into the depths in a single, accelerating motion. At 4:27 a.m., U-623 disappeared beneath the surface. The Liberator circled twice, confirming the kill. An expanding oil slick spread across the Atlantic, shimmering in the early morning light. No lifeboats, no debris, no survivors. The aircraft transmitted the coordinates to Coastal Command before returning to its patrol arc. One submarine destroyed, one node removed from the shrinking network of German undersea forces. Beneath the surface, U-623 sank past 50 meters, then 100. Pressure increased exponentially. The hull imploded before reaching 200 meters, collapsing inward in a violent rush of compressed air and metal. The wreck fell silent on the seafloor, fractured into multiple sections, each torn by the final collapse. The Atlantic closed over the site without a trace. For the Allies, the sinking of U-623 was one of many victories in the spring of 1943. The new radar technology allowed aircraft to sweep the ocean with a level of detection previously unimaginable. Centimetric waves revealed submarines at night, in fog, and beneath cloud cover. The U-boat fleet bled crews and hulls at an increasing rate. Losses rose beyond replacement capacity. The Atlantic, once dominated by German submarines, shifted into Allied control. For Germany, each loss carried strategic weight. Experienced commanders vanished. Boats never returned. Training schools struggled to fill ranks with inexperienced replacements. Morale declined as rumors spread of invisible Allied weapons capable of seeing through darkness. The ocean had changed. Air power had turned the sea into a battlefield where submarines no longer held advantage. Radar stripped them of stealth. Escort carriers extended patrol reach. Sonar buoys marked positions. Depth charge patterns grew more precise. The world that U-623 had known, the world where the night protected and the sea shielded, had vanished. In the months that followed, the Kriegsmarine suffered unprecedented losses. May 1943 marked the worst month in U-boat history. 41 submarines lost, thousands of sailors gone, entire wolf packs decimated before striking a single convoy. Admiral Donitz withdrew his remaining boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging the change only when casualties became unsustainable. The war beneath the waves had reached a new phase. Technology, not numbers, decided outcomes. The story of U-623 was repeated across the Atlantic. Boats detected at night. Boats sunk before sighting the enemy. Boats destroyed by aircraft that never appeared on radar warning receivers. The surface submarine had become obsolete the moment the Allies introduced a weapon that could see through darkness. The men aboard U-623 were entombed beneath the ocean, their names recorded in Kriegsmarine archives, their fates sealed in official reports that described the loss as missing. Families received letters with little detail. The Atlantic kept the rest. Time moved forward. The war shifted to new fronts. But the moment when the Liberator descended upon U-623 marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, a moment when stealth gave way to exposure, when night gave way to detection, when the hunter became the hunted. The surface had become a battlefield. The darkness had become transparent. And the ocean, once ruled by steel and silence, belonged to the sky. Whatever aircraft approached was flying low. and it was coming closer. Kessler raised the periscope again. A wave broke over the optics, distorting the view momentarily. Then the surface cleared. The horizon shimmered in soft dawn light. A dark shape emerged in the distance. Low, large, approaching fast. The outline sharpened through the periscope lens. A high-wing aircraft with a deep fuselage and 4 engines moving in tight formation around its nose-mounted radar blister. A maritime patrol bomber. American. A consolidated B-24 Liberator modified for anti-submarine warfare. Its belly bristled with depth charges. Its nose housed ASV radar. Its wings cast a long silhouette across the pale sky. It was heading straight toward them. Kessler's pulse quickened once, then slowed with cold clarity. The crew stood motionless, watching his face. They knew the look. They had seen it during earlier attacks. The realization that death hovered just above the waterline. He lowered the periscope. The Liberator closed the distance rapidly. Battery charge, 59%. Depth, 9 meters. Air, critical. No options remained. Kessler's face hardened with the clarity that marked the final stage of command decisions. He steadied his breath. The hull creaked. The crew braced instinctively. Every man felt the weight of what was coming. The Liberator's engines thundered closer. The ocean above no longer concealed them. And when U-623 broke the surface, the aircraft would be waiting. The surface had become an ambush, and they were rising into it.